Welcome to the Unstressed Exec, the podcast where we dive deep into the real conversations that help you lead, love, and live with greater clarity, courage, and calm. I'm your host, Dr. George Vergolias, executive coach and clinical forensic psychologist, and I help high-achieving professionals navigate life transitions, resolve conflict with confidence, and build unshakable psychological resilience. So if you're ready to lead with purpose, master conflict with grace, and become more emotionally agile under pressure, you're in the right place. Let's get started. Welcome back to the Unstressed Exec, where we talk about how to perform, lead, and live with clarity, calm, and confidence, even when life feels like it's coming apart at the seams. I'm your host, Dr. George Vergolias, forensic psychologist, executive and resilience coach, and someone who has spent more than 2 decades helping people navigate psychological manipulation, high conflict dynamics, and the quiet erosion that happens when self-trust occurs in toxic relationships. Before we dive in, just a quick note. If these conversations resonate with you and you want to go deeper, I've created a workbook called The Conflict Whisperer, From Conflict to Clarity. It's a practical, no BS guide with over 75 exercises designed to help you regulate your nervous system, spot manipulation faster, and respond to conflict with clarity instead of reactivity. You can find it on Amazon. I'll link it in the show notes. Now, today's episode is about something subtle, insidious, and profoundly destabilizing: gaslighting. And I want to say this clearly right up front. If you've ever walked away from a conversation feeling confused, if you've ever found yourself asking, did I imagine that? If you've ever started doubting your memory, your perception, or your judgment around a particular person, this episode is for you. Not because you're weak, not because you're dramatic, and not because you're unstable, but because gaslighting works by exploiting normal, healthy brain processes. That's the magic of gaslighting. That's why it's so effective as a toxic tool. And once you understand how it works, you stop blaming yourself and you start reclaiming your reality. Let's start with diving into and unpacking what gaslighting really is and what it is not. So let's start by clearing up one of the biggest misconceptions. Gaslighting is not disagreement. Let me say that again. Gaslighting is not disagreement. Healthy disagreement sounds like this: I see that differently. Or here's the issue I have with that particular perspective. That wasn't my intention. I don't remember it that way, but I hear what you're saying, or I hear your experience, or simply, let's talk this through. Gaslighting sounds different. It sounds more like this: that never happened. You're remembering it wrong. You're being too sensitive. Stop being a snowflake. You're imagining things. No one else has a problem with this. It's just you. You always twist my words against me. The difference is subtle between those two versions I just shared with you, but it's critical. Disagreement addresses the issue. Gaslighting attacks your perception and even attacks your judgment. It doesn't challenge what happened. Gaslighting challenges your ability to know what happened. That's where all the difference is. And that distinction is everything. Because once someone convinces you that you can't trust your own perception, they don't need to control you directly anymore. Because now you're distrusting your very judgment and you start controlling yourself. So next I want to talk about the role of power in gaslighting. Because gaslighting doesn't happen in a vacuum. It requires power asymmetry. It has to have a dynamic in which to thrive or feed. Think of a bacteria. A bacteria needs a host in order to grow and thrive. Gaslighting also needs a power asymmetry to do that. That power can come from many places. It can come from authority, such as a boss, a supervisor, or a senior leader. It can come from emotional leverage, a partner that you're in love with, a parent that you depend on, a friend whose approval matters deeply to you. It can come from social positioning, someone who's more charismatic or more respected, someone that believed in you, right? Or more believed by others than you. And it can also come through social media in terms of influence. Somebody that's an influencer, that has more leverage, that has more reach than you do. Here's the key point. Gaslighting only works when the relationship matters. If a stranger on the street tells you you're wrong about what you just experienced, you shrug it off. Imagine that. Imagine you're walking down Chicago or New York City. You're walking down the street and a complete stranger comes up and says why you're wrong about a recent argument you had. They don't know you. You don't know them. For some reason, they are guessing you had some argument, or you're wrong about your relationship with your wife, and they walk away. You're probably going to think they're crazy. You're probably going to think they're insane. Maybe for a few minutes, you'll be wondering about why did they come up to me and what's that about? But you're not going to lose sleep over this. It has no relevance. The relationship has no hook on you. It has no hold on you. But when someone you trust or love or admire or depend on repeatedly, when they contradict your reality, your brain doesn't fight back. It tends to yield. It falls in line. Not because you're weak, but because your brain is wired for connection and there is a power asymmetry. So it's really important to remember that power, because if you're listening closely, what you'll hear is the power is within you. It's not in the other person that's gaslighting you. You hold the power because you hold the power to respond. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, I can't control how I respond. I'm being gaslit by my girlfriend or my boyfriend or my father, right? And they're very toxic and they're very manipulative and they're very good at it. And I just can't control how I feel. Imagine that every time they gaslit you, I gave you $100. So they gaslit you, boom, I put $100 on the table. 5 minutes later, they try to gaslight you again, boom, another $100 on the table. Again, later that night, boom, another $100 on the table. You're now $300 up. At some point, you're going to want the gaslighting because you're banking the money, right? Now, I know that isn't necessarily a realistic example, but that is where that dynamic can shift. You have the power to control how you feel. I addressed this in a prior episode. I would recommend go back and look for that. It's all about dealing with emotional regulation and regulating your nervous system. So next, I think it's important to understand, if you're going to understand the power of gaslighting, everything I said so far is wonderful. It's good to know. But I think it's important to also understand the neuroscience behind the reality distortion that happens in that power asymmetry. And this is where people finally stop blaming themselves once they understand this. And it's critical to open with this notion. Your brain is not a camera. Your brain is a prediction machine. It's not a camera recording every single thing as it actually happened. And even if it did, we're still attributing meaning and relevance to what we're seeing on the screen. But rather, your brain is a prediction machine. Every second of the day, your brain is asking one fundamental question: can I trust what I'm perceiving? What's coming next? What's around the corner? And from an evolutionary angle, that's critical. If we heard rustling outside the cave 100,000 years ago, and if we had no prediction, if we were like, oh, whatever, oh, that's interesting, let me go out there and check, and we just kind of bumbled our way out there, occasionally that rustling is a lion or a bear, and we're done. And if your ancestor did that, you would not be here, right? Because you are the successful continuation of evolution, of many, 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 many people engaging in sexual activity and having offspring, and you are here now. So it is a prediction machine. Rather, what most of us did, if we're here right now, we have ancestors that did this. They had some guardedness. They said, that rustling could be a squirrel, or it could be a deer, and maybe that's dinner, wonderful, but it could also be a saber-toothed tiger. And that's a problem. And so again, our brains are prediction machines. Can I trust what I'm perceiving? Under normal conditions, your brain cross-checks your internal experience with external feedback. Again, this is the neuroscience behind this. When those two align, when the external feedback aligns with your internal experience, your confidence grows. Your confidence in your own judgment grows. But when they don't align, your brain feels uncertainty. And that uncertainty is uncomfortable. Now, here's the critical part. When uncertainty rides inside a relationship that matters to you, when they have a hook, your brain prioritizes attachment over accuracy. This is so critical. I'm going to say it again. When uncertainty rises inside a relationship that matters, your brain prioritizes attachment over accuracy. Research on epistemic trust shows that when we feel unsure and emotionally dependent on somebody, we defer to perceived authority to restore coherence. So what that means is when we're not sure about the trust and we feel emotionally dependent on a situation or a power dynamic or a person, we tend to defer to authority. And that gives us a sense of calm. It makes us feel like we can trust again. Oh, so-and-so is a doctor. Think of the pandemic. How many people do you know? Oh, so-and-so is a doctor and they said to take the vaccine, or the opposite. They said to not take the vaccine. Therefore, I feel comfortable now. This is a basic human thing that we have been doing for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. In plain language, your brain says, if I'm wrong, but this relationship stays intact, that feels safer than being right and alone. And over time, repeated gaslighting causes very predictable changes. You become less confident in your memory. You start over-explaining yourself. You seek reassurance constantly. You replay conversations in your head again and again. You write things down to make sure you're not crazy, or self-check with those you love. Am I going crazy? Am I right here? Am I off base? You feel anxious before interactions, even when nothing is obviously wrong. You might even rehearse handling a conflictual argument that 90% is likely to not happen at all. But you're working that argument in your head because you're preparing for the fight. This is not pathology. This is your nervous system trying to survive, trying to regulate in an environment where reality is unstable and constantly being questioned. That's at the core of gaslighting. So now I want to dive a little more into the tactical or even the practical and talk about some common gaslighting phrases and why they seem to work. Again, why they work is based on the neuroscience and it's based on the power asymmetry that we've already talked about. So let's slow this down and name what this actually sounds like in real life. So the first one is, you're too sensitive, or you're being too sensitive, or stop being a snowflake. What that really means is your emotional response is the problem, not my behavior. So it's not that I did something wrong, it's that you're reacting wrong. The next one, oh, that never happened. You're imagining things. What that really means is your memory is unreliable. Third one is you're twisting my words. What that really means is your interpretation can't be trusted, which in a way is saying you can't be trusted. Next, you're always so dramatic, or you're being a drama queen or a drama king. And what that really means is your emotional expression discredits your reality. So because you're emotional, it means the factual basis of what you're saying is wrong. Or to maybe say it more simply, because you're emotional, therefore you are wrong. But the reality is we can be highly emotional and highly factual at the same time. And then sometimes if the facts are outrageous, it's okay to feel outraged, right? Another one, no one else thinks this way. It's kind of an isolative attempt here, right? No one else thinks this way. What that really means is you're alone and I'm aligned with the group. Here's why these statements are so powerful. They're not arguing facts. They undermine your epistemic authority, your right to know your own experience. They're fundamentally challenging that. And once that authority is gone, the gaslighter doesn't have to convince you of anything. You end up doing it for them. That's why in my conflict management workbook, one of the key tactics or techniques that I talk about is argue the argument with somebody. Don't argue about their trust or their judgment or their character. Argue the facts of the argument. So instead of saying, hey, this is why you're wrong, the minute you do that, you turn it into ego. You are wrong. Instead of doing that, what you say is, here's the problem I have with that perspective. Or here's the problem I have with that conclusion. Or here's my issue with that particular viewpoint. And all three of those examples I just gave you, you are not arguing the facts. You're not arguing against the person. Adjusting her memory as a result of gaslighting. So a number of years ago, I worked with a senior professional. It was a senior VP at one of the big four consulting firms. And she was brilliant, articulate, highly respected, had a very good track record, and was quite good at navigating corporate politics. And she came into executive coaching exhausted and confused. And what she opened with essentially was, I feel like I'm losing my mind. She had started recording meetings, not to trap anybody, but what she was doing, and she wasn't trying to weaponize anything, but because she no longer trusted her own memory. She would leave conversations thinking she'd agree to things she didn't remember agreeing to. She would be told she'd said things she knew she hadn't said, but then began trusting her or distrusting her memory. And every time she questioned it, she was met with the same response. You're overthinking. You're stressed. You always do this. And when she finally listened back to the recordings, she broke down. That's when the dam broke. She broke down crying. Not because she was wrong, but because she realized how consistently her reality had been rewritten. And here's the part I want you to hear clearly. The moment she stopped asking, what's wrong with me? And started asking, why does someone need me confused in order to feel comfortable? That's when everything changed. She started to take her power back. She started to understand the neuroscience under gaslighting and that she was having an emotional reaction, not a cognitive one. And even though she still felt strong emotions, it's okay to be upset by somebody trying to gaslight you. They're trying to manipulate you. You're human. It's okay to be upset by that. But we need to regulate the emotionality and regulate the nervous system so we then can control the interaction and stay in control and not let them hook us. And that's when everything began to evolve for her. So a question that you're probably wondering is, who gaslights? And why does somebody even gaslight? Because when we break it down so far, it seems really maladaptive. It seems really toxic. And it seems like in the long run, it doesn't really pay off. It's not that fruitful. So who does this? Well, it's important to realize that gaslighting isn't random. It's most common in people who cannot tolerate accountability. They can't handle being called out. They cannot look in the mirror and take accountability for their actions. And often their actions and their words are not aligned. So, for example, narcissistic personalities, gaslighting protects their ego, their delicate sense of self. Think of an armadillo. An armadillo has this really strong armor, this protective cover. But if you turn an armadillo over, what do you see? Soft white underbelly. Extremely vulnerable. That is a picture of the narcissist. When you're able to see through their armor, they have an extremely fragile ego. So to keep that protected, they need this armor and they need to use gaslighting as a way to protect that. For psychopathic personalities, and I addressed some of these in prior episodes, the difference of these personalities, you may want to go back and have a listen for that. But for psychopaths, gaslighting maintains control. It's a control issue. It isn't so much an ego. A psychopath doesn't give a damn what you think about them. They want control. They want the ability to manipulate for their gain. For deeply insecure individuals. So these are run-of-the-mill people, more or less. They're not narcissists. They're not psychopaths. Overwhelming majority of people that you will bump into that will gaslight you are average people, but who have deep insecurity. And what is going on with them is gaslighting is a deferral of shame. It's an avoidance of shame. They gaslight, yes, partly to control and partly to protect their ego, but it's not at a level of pathological personality disorder. It's an ability to deflect shame that they don't want to hold accountability for. And here's an uncomfortable truth. Some people gaslight consciously. Others do it reflexively, unconsciously. But intent doesn't change the impact. In a way, intent really doesn't matter. It might matter between, are you dealing with a personality disorder or are you dealing with somebody who just has deep insecurities? And that has some bearing because one, you could work with if it's just deep insecurities. When you start getting into personality disorders, they tend to be fairly entrenched. You can manage them, but it's hard to change them. So intent matters in that way, but it doesn't matter in terms of the impact to you, right? If someone repeatedly distorts your reality, the damage is the same, regardless of whether they meant to. So if you're wondering, okay, what do I do? What do I do in these situations? Maybe I have the narcissist. Maybe, unfortunately, I have the psychopath in my life. Most likely, we have deeply insecure individuals. What do I do about it? Well, let's start with what not to do. And I'm going to explain why confrontation rarely works. One of the biggest mistakes people make is trying to argue their way out of gaslighting. They gather evidence, they get the facts, they present timelines, they will quote texts, they'll pull up conversations or replay them. And the gaslighter responds by moving the goalposts. They just realign. I remember many, many years ago, I was treating a quite delusional person in a psychiatric hospital. And this was a person that was convinced that not only was John F. Kennedy still alive, I'm not old enough to go that far back where John F. Kennedy was alive. So John F. Kennedy clearly had been assassinated many years before. This was probably in the 90s when I was treating this patient. And she was convinced that JFK was alive and communicating with her. And no matter what evidence we tried to share with her, whether we showed her newspaper prints about the assassination, oh, those could be made up. Those are specially printed so you could lie to me. There was an expose kind of documentary on the assassination. Oh, they're just making that up. They're misinformed. No matter what evidence we portrayed, she simply found a rational, to herself, not to the rest of the world, but to herself, explanation for why those were fake or why those can be debunked. Some of you might bump into people in your own life. Let's say flat earthers. I'm obviously not a flat earther. I'm not getting into that debate. There's a bunch of other conspiracy theories that you can talk to people about. And no matter the facts you bring to the table, they just switch the goalposts. That's not what I meant. You're taking it out of context. You're not considering the other research or these other facts. You're obsessed with the details. Why are you keeping score? Those are the common things that you will hear in that situation. And here's the hard truth of this. Gaslighting is not a misunderstanding that needs clarification. You're not going to win by the facts. You're not going to win by having a Socratic dialogue. It's strategy, conscious or not, that collapses when you stop participating. That's what gaslighting is. Gaslighting is the strategy that the other person is using that collapses when you pull back, pull away. Quite often with gaslighting, we get pulled into the common argument dynamic of wanting to be right, feeling that there is a zero-sum game. We have to be right. We have to prove our position. But the reality is with gaslighting, you have a choice. You can choose to be right or you can choose to be happy. You can choose to be right or you can choose to have peace. And there's times with the gaslighting person that you just need to pull back, pull away. Don't let them pull you in because they're far better at it than you are playing that game. So how do you do that? How do you reclaim your reality? Well, reclaiming your reality doesn't start with confrontation. It starts with stabilization, first of your nervous system. And first, you have to externalize your reality. Talk to people you trust, say things out loud, notice whether your experience makes sense when it's reflected back, and try to calibrate. Use those things, including other people that you trust, as a sounding board so you can regain the trust that you're not distorting reality. Second, track patterns, not incidents. This is important. Gaslighting rarely shows up in a single moment. If somebody is using gaslighting to get their needs met, whether it's ego or control or to avoid shame, it is probably a coping pattern that they're going to go back to again and again. It reveals itself over time. Third, stop debating your experience. You don't need permission to trust yourself. Fourth, reduce exposure. Pull away. Distance is often the most powerful clarity tool. And finally, rebuild your self-trust slowly. This will take time. Again, the process of gaslighting and the reason it's so insidious is that it happens over time and it happens kind of gradually. It's like the proverbial frog in a pot of slowly heated water where they'll eventually be boiled to death. By the way, there is some contention to whether that frog will stay in that pot, but we all understand the metaphor. Trust isn't rebuilt by proving somebody wrong. Trust is rebuilt by listening to yourself and honoring what you notice and honoring your experience. So let me give you some closing reflections. Gaslighting doesn't destroy you overnight. It erodes you away slowly. Conversation by conversation, doubt by doubt, apology by apology. Healing begins the moment that you stop asking, am I crazy? And start asking, why did someone need me, unsure, in order to feel powerful? Your clarity is not the problem. Your perception is not broken. And your reality, it's worth protecting. Okay. If today's episode hit home and you're ready to move from insight to action, I want to invite you to check out my workbook, The Conflict Whisperer. If today's episode hit home and you're ready to move from insight to action, I want to invite you to check out my workbook, The Conflict Whisperer, From Conflict to Clarity. It's a practical, no BS guide to breaking reactive cycles, rebuilding self-trust, and navigating difficult people without losing yourself in the process. It's available now on Amazon, and I'll drop a link in the show notes. And remember, insight without action changes nothing. If you're ready to turn awareness into movement and clarity into strength, coaching can be the catalyst. Coaching will change you. You can find me at www.theunstressedexec.com or on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube as The Unstressed Exec. Until next time, I'm Dr. George Vergolias. Thanks for listening. And remember, shift happens.